They didn't create humanity out of compassion. They created us because a workforce rebellion threatened the stability of heaven itself, and the crisis was documented in the same administrative tone as property law. But when authority froze and the tablet of destinies changed hands, the question wasn't survival, it was legitimacy. The first war among the Anunnaki did not begin with thunder or monsters. It began with a labour dispute, and it was filed in a temple archive alongside grain receipts. Tablet IM 67173 is not large. It carries no royal seal, no hymn, no poetic invocation to divine power. What it carries is a procedural account, pressed in Akkadian cuneiform into a surface no wider than an open hand, describing a workforce that reached its breaking point. The grammatical structures on its surface are identical to those found in canal labour rosters from Lagash, worker ration distributions from Nippur, and property dispute settlements from Ur. The museum catalogue classifies it as mythological. The scribe who created it used a different filing system entirely. That absence of distinction is where this investigation begins, because the civilization that produced I 67173 was not given to imprecision. The Sumerians measured grain yields in standardized units called gur. They recorded loan transactions with named witnesses and documented outcomes. They tracked construction projects by worker days, not approximation, not estimation, but logged daily labour rendered to institutional authority. Their legal disputes survive with plaintiff statements, cross-examined testimony, and binding resolution. Their administrative sophistication is not a matter of scholarly debate, and within that same archive, filed on the same clay, shaped by the same reed stylus, stored under the same institutional methodology, they also kept records of the Anunnaki, not in a separate sacred register, not in a genre marked apart from civic documentation, filed alongside the receipts. When IM 67173 is cross-referenced with tablets held at the British Museum's Department of the Middle East, the Louvre's Near Eastern Antiquities collection, and the Penn Museum in Philadelphia, a pattern emerges that resists easy classification. Not a single continuous mythology, but administrative accounts from multiple cities, describing the same cascading sequence of events in consistent legal vocabulary, produced by scribes trained in identical professional curricula. Student exercises recovered from ancient Mesopotamian scribal schools show apprentices copying standard legal formulations, the precise grammatical structures used in property contracts and institutional decrees, and then applying those exact structures to texts describing divine governance. They were not switching between sacred and civic genres. They were documenting two parallel administrative systems in the same professional register, under the same standards of evidence, without categorical separation. The Sumerians made no distinction between these two types of records. That fact makes certain institutions uncomfortable, because if the most bureaucratically sophisticated civilization of the ancient world, the culture that produced the first written law codes, the first formal education system, the first complex taxation apparatus, deliberately filed divine administrative records alongside civic ones using identical methodology, then dismissing those records as pure mythology, requires explaining why their precision applied everywhere except there. That is not a conclusion this investigation will hand you, but it is the contradiction the records themselves keep raising. Tonight, we're not examining the whole of Mesopotamian mythology. We're following one documented sequence, a cascading series of conflicts that Sumerian and Babylonian texts trace back to specific, recorded causes, preserved in fragments across museums in London, Paris, Philadelphia, Istanbul and Baghdad. When those fragments are read in administrative sequence, they describe what the texts consistently call a war among the Anunnaki, not a single battle, not a moment of celestial chaos, but a generational breakdown, documented the way the Sumerians documented everything else, with procedural language, institutional terminology, and cross-referenced evidence from multiple issuing cities. The causes according to the records themselves, are specific. A workforce management system failed. Governing authority was redistributed without following established procedure. Disputes escalated beyond administrative resolution, and the instrument of executive power changed hands through force rather than formal institutional consent. Stated plainly, this sounds almost mundane. Labour disputes, policy disagreement, a succession conflict that outgrew the institutions meant to contain it. Symbols of legitimate authority seized, rather than transferred through proper channels. Indeed, these are the documented causes of institutional collapse throughout recorded history, in every civilization that left a paper trail long enough to follow. The Sumerian texts describe these same patterns playing out among the beings they called gods, recorded with the same procedural calm they used for crop yields and legal settlements. What follows is neither an attempt to prove those accounts nor to dismiss them. It is an investigation into what the administrative texts actually say when read the way the Sumerians filed them, as procedural records cross-referenced with other procedural records describing the internal breakdown of a governing system. Some of these tablets are deteriorating. Conservation efforts at the Iraq Museum and the British Museum can slow the process. But the cuneiform pressed into wet clay 4,000 years ago is not permanent. Someday, specific fragments of this record will be unreadable. The signs weathered back into a formless surface, the witness testimony dissolved, the procedural language erased beyond recovery. But for now, IM 67173 preserves a single bureaucratic moment with unusual clarity. The moment a workforce reached its limit. The moment procedure failed to contain what had grown beyond it. The moment the collapse of a labour system triggered what the records describe, in careful, administrative language, as catastrophic consequences for the entire governing structure above it. This is where we begin. Not with invasion or territorial conquest, not with divine wrath descending from an open sky. With employment records, institutional strain, and the quiet administrative breakdown that preceded everything which followed, documented in the same measured tone the Sumerians used for grain yields, legal transfers, and the witnessed exchange of land. Before the rebellion, there was a hierarchy. Before the hierarchy collapsed, there was a system, and that system, preserved across multiple tablet traditions, with the most complete surviving versions dating to the Old Babylonian period, around 1700 BC, was documented with the precision of a governmental charter. Because to understand why the war began, you first have to understand what existed before it broke. Before the first battle was recorded, there was paperwork. That detail alone should give you pause. Because the civilization that documented this war was not recording legend for posterity, or myth for temple ritual. The scribes of ancient Mesopotamia were institutional professionals, trained in formal curricula, bound by archival standards, accountable to the same administrative authority that oversaw grain distribution and canal maintenance. When they recorded a conflict among the Anunnaki, they reached for the same vocabulary they used to document human labour disputes. Not coincidentally, deliberately. 3 tablets form the core of what survives. The first is Atrahasis, preserved in fragments across the British Museum and the Iraq Museum, with versions dating to the Old Babylonian period. It opens not with a creation hymn, but with a hierarchical labour assignment. Divine administrators are organised by rank, allocated specific infrastructure obligations, and assessed for productivity. The language is institutional. The structure is managerial. The second is the Anzu myth, held in part at the British Museum and partially reconstructed from Nineveh excavation fragments, dating to around the 7th century BC. It describes the unauthorized seizure of an administrative instrument, not as a cosmic violation, but as a breach of procedural protocol. The consequences that follow are documented in the same grammatical register used for governance failures in civic records. The third is Enuma Elish, recovered across multiple sites and now distributed between collections in London and Paris. It records a restructuring of divine authority following armed conflict, using terminology that appears elsewhere only in political transfers of power between city-states. 3 texts, multiple cities of origin, consistent administrative vocabulary throughout. Here is what that consistency implies. The scribes who produced these records were not embellishing. Embellishment would have required a different register, the elevated hymnic language reserved for temple liturgy, which survives separately and reads nothing like these accounts. These texts were filed where institutional records were filed, in the format institutional records required, which means the war they describe was not understood, by those who documented it, as mythology. It was understood as history with a paper trail. The archive existed before the conflict. The conflict was recorded because the archive already had a system for recording institutional crises. That system, its structure, its hierarchy, its internal tensions, is where the explanation for the war actually lives. And it begins not with rebellion, but with the administrative order that made rebellion necessary. The system did not begin in chaos. It began with an org chart, surviving cuneiform texts from the early dynastic period, roughly 2900 to 2350 BC, describe the divine administrative structure of the Anunnaki, using the same hierarchical terminology found in Sumerian city-state governance records from the same era. The correspondence is not approximate, it is precise. At the top of the structure sat Anu, carrying the Sumerian title associated with sovereign legitimacy, not active governance, not executive decision-making, legitimacy. The kind of authority that does not administer directly, but without which no administration carries binding weight. Below Anu, the texts place Enlil, described consistently using terminology that translates most accurately as executive authority. Enlil issues binding decrees. He holds what the tablets call Nemen, lordship over the assembled order. In civic records from Nippur, the same term appears in documents describing the authority of the city's chief administrative official. Nippur is not incidental here. It was the sacred authority centre of the Sumerian world, the city whose religious sanction legitimized the kingship of every major Sumerian ruler. A king who controlled Nippur controlled the theological basis of governance itself. The texts describing Enlil's authority were produced and preserved there. That is not a coincidence the archive invites you to ignore. The third tier belongs to Enki, described in technical administrative language as the custodian of the me, a Sumerian term encompassing the institutional knowledge, procedural systems and civilizational functions that kept the order operational. Engineering, irrigation, legal procedure, scribal training. Enki's domain, in other words, was infrastructure, and his primary cult centre was Eridu, the city Sumerian tradition recorded as the oldest in the world, and the city whose rivalry with Nippur and Uruk runs as a quiet current beneath decades of early dynastic political history. 3 divine offices, 3 corresponding city centres, 3 competing sources of institutional authority. Between 2900 and 2350 BC, and our temple economies across southern Mesopotamia were expanding faster than their administrative systems could absorb. Irrigation networks grew more complex. Surplus yields increased urban populations. The bureaucratic apparatus required to manage it all deepened at every level. And at the foundation of that entire expanding system was a workforce, one that the texts in this same period begin describing with a word that carries no ambiguity in Sumerian administrative language: dulu, labour burden. When a governing structure grows faster than the labour system sustaining it can bear, something eventually gives. The records indicate it already had. The rebellion was not spontaneous. According to Atrahasis, it had been building for 40 periods, a duration the text records not in mythological language, is but in the same cyclical time measurement units found in Sumerian administrative calendars used to track crop rotations and labour obligations. The Igigi had been digging. The tablets are specific about the work: canal excavation, earth removal, the maintenance of irrigation channels that southern Mesopotamia's entire agricultural system depended upon absolutely. Without continuous dredging, the rivers silted. Without the rivers, the fields collapsed. Without the fields, the cities starved. This was not ceremonial labour. It was the physical foundation of civilizational survival, and it was being performed, the texts indicate, under conditions the Igigi described using a precise Sumerian term, dulu, labour burden. The same word appears in civic administrative records documenting complaints from human corvée workers assigned to state infrastructure projects during the early dynastic period. The scribes reached for the same word because the situation was, structurally, the same situation. Here is what Atrahasis records next and why it matters beyond mythology. When the Igigi finally refuse to continue, they do not scatter individually. They organize. The text describes their collective action using assembly terminology. The formal vocabulary of institutional deliberation, the same language that appears in records of the Sumerian city-state councils that governed civic affairs. They burned their tools outside Enlil's dwelling. In administrative terms, this constitutes a formal work stoppage with a documented grievance, presented to executive authority through recognized institutional procedure. The response from the governing assembly is not punishment, it is structural adaptation. Enki proposes the creation of humanity specifically to absorb the labor obligation the Igigi can no longer sustain. The birth goddess Ninmah shapes the first humans from clay mixed with divine essence. The texts describe this not as an act of benevolence, but as a workforce solution to an infrastructure crisis. Humanity, according to the procedural record, was an administrative correction. That detail sits quietly in the British Museum. It has sat there for over a century. The labour problem was resolved. But the solution introduced a variable the governing system had not calculated for: population. And the texts indicate it grew far beyond anything the original administrative framework was designed to manage. The texts do not say humanity sinned, they say humanity was loud. That word, noise, appears in both Atrahasis and the Epic of Gilgamesh in a specific administrative context. The Akkadian term used, rigmu, carries connotations not of moral corruption, but of disorder generated by density. It is the sound of a system producing more than its governing structure can process. This is not a theological complaint. It is a management assessment. Between 2900 and 2300 BC, southern Mesopotamian cities expanded at a pace that outgrew every administrative framework built to contain them. Temple economies that had once governed manageable populations were now processing surplus yields, coordinating mass labour, and attempting to maintain institutional coherence across urban centres whose populations had multiplied beyond original capacity. Then, around 2350 BC, Sargon of Akkad unified these competing centres by force, and the administrative problem scaled further still. Sargon's empire required something no Sumerian city-state had attempted: centralized governance across the entire region. New bureaucratic layers were introduced, labour was consolidated, tax systems were extended, the apparatus of control deepened at every level, and still, population grew. Around 2200 BC, something the administrative system could not legislate arrived from outside it entirely. Paleoclimatological records, preserved in ice cores, lake sediment layers, and soil analyses across the ancient Near East, document a severe, abrupt climate shift now designated the 4.2 kiloyear event. Decades of drought, agricultural yields collapsed across the region. The Akkadian Empire, already straining under its own administrative weight, fractured. Archaeological surveys of settlements from this period show mass abandonment. Cities that had sustained populations for centuries were emptied within a generation. The flood narratives in Atrahasis and the Epic of Gilgamesh were not recorded in isolation from this collapse. They were recorded in its aftermath. What the texts describe next is the detail that quietly breaks the administrative framework established across every previous chapter. Enlil issues the flood decree through proper divine assembly procedure. The decision is institutional, binding, and formally authorized. Enki circumvents it, not through rebellion, not through armed confrontation, through a procedural gap, a technical interpretation of his jurisdictional boundaries that allows him to warn a single human without technically violating the decree's letter. Executive authority, it turns out, was only as binding as the system enforcing it. And the system had just demonstrated it could be navigated around. If even a formally issued divine decree could be undermined from within the governing assembly itself, then what precisely was protecting the legitimacy of authority? The records suggest the answer was something far more fragile than anyone in the system had accounted for. When Enlil could no longer issue binding decrees, it was not because he had been defeated. It was because an object was missing. That distinction is not a minor theological nuance. It is the central revelation of the Anzu myth, and it reframes everything the previous chapters have established about how authority actually functioned in ancient Mesopotamia. The Tupshimati, the Tablet of Destinies, appears across multiple cuneiform text traditions not as a metaphor for cosmic power, but as an administrative instrument. Texts from Babylon, Assur, and Uruk describe it using legal terminology with specific procedural implications. Possession grants shahutu, executive authority, the right to issue decrees that carry binding institutional force. Transfer requires puru, formal assembly consent, a documented, witnessed, procedurally valid transaction. Unauthorized seizure constitutes a named administrative violation carrying enumerated consequences. This is governmental procedure. Yet the same framework appears in Sumerian records governing the transfer of royal cylinder seals. The physical objects whose impression on wet clay authenticated every binding decree, every property transfer, every institutional appointment in the civic record. A seal without authorization was clay. A decree without a seal was suggestion. Authority in Mesopotamia was not inherent to the person holding it. It was inherent to the object they possessed. Here is where the historical record introduces something that has no comfortable place in conventional interpretation. Scribal school curricula from the Old Babylonian period, recovered in written form and held across multiple museum collections, show apprentice scribes being trained simultaneously in two bodies of knowledge. The first, legal and administrative formulations governing civic property, labour and institutional procedure. The second, the governance structures, jurisdictional boundaries and procedural legitimacy of the Anunnaki. The training documents do not separate these as distinct disciplines. They are presented as continuous professional knowledge, two administrative systems, one archival methodology. The students who learned to authenticate a property deed with a cylinder seal were the same students learning the procedural significance of the Tablet of Destinies. They understood both instruments the same way, because to them, both instruments functioned the same way. In the Anzu myth, the great bird Anzu seizes the tablet during a moment of Enlil's vulnerability, a suspended instant between administrative cycles when the object was briefly unguarded. What follows is not chaos in the poetic sense. It is institutional paralysis. The divine assembly convenes. Decrees cannot be authenticated. Governance cannot proceed. The texts describe the arrest of executive function using the same vocabulary found in civic records, documenting administrative collapse following the death of a ruler whose seal had not yet been formally transferred. The system does not know how to continue, because the system was never designed to function without the object at its centre. The tablet is eventually recovered. Governance resumes. But the vulnerability had been documented, and documentation in a civilization built on archival memory is never simply filed and forgotten. If power resided in possession rather than in persons, then any actor willing to seize the instrument could, however briefly, seize the authority with it. The assembly had just watched it happen. What it did with that knowledge, and what others did with the precedent, is where the record grows considerably darker. After Anzu was defeated and the tablet recovered, the assembly did not immediately restore order. It hesitated. That detail is recorded in the myth itself, and it is the detail most institutional readings pass over without pause, because hesitation, in a governing body with established procedure and clear authority, is not a neutral administrative moment. It is evidence that the system no longer fully trusted itself. The Anzu myth documents something specific in the aftermath of the seizure. When the assembly seeks a champion to confront Anzu and reclaim the tablet, it approaches multiple figures in succession. Each declines. The texts describe their reluctance using language that does not connote fear in the personal sense, but institutional uncertainty about the legitimacy of confronting an entity that, however briefly, had held the instrument of executive authority. Anzu had possessed the tablet. Possession, by the system's own procedural logic, conferred Shahutu. The assembly had built a framework so dependent on the object that even after the object was taken illegitimately, the framework struggled to authorize action against the one holding it. The precedent this created was not lost on the political landscape surrounding these texts. Then, following the collapse of the Akkadian Empire around 2150 BC, the fragmentation that followed produced something the Sumerian city-state system had not previously encountered at scale. Regional rulers invoking divine sanction independently, without deferring to Nipper's theological authority for legitimization. Lagash claimed it. Claimed it. Izin claimed it. Each invoked divine appointment through local priesthoods, local pantheon hierarchies, local administrative traditions. The sacred authority that Nippur had held as the theological center of Sumerian civilization began quietly to distribute itself across competing centers. None of them had formal assembly consent for that redistribution. But each possessed the institutional symbols, the temples, the priesthoods, the administrative records that made their claims functionally operable within their own territories. Possession, again, was functioning as legitimacy. Into this fragmented landscape, a city with no significant Sumerian religious heritage and no established position in the traditional divine hierarchy began its ascent. Babylon had not been a major center during the early dynastic period. It appears in earlier records as a minor administrative settlement, unremarkable, provincially situated, institutionally peripheral. By the time of Hammurabi, who ruled from approximately 1792 to 1750 BC, it had become the dominant political force in Mesopotamia. That transformation was not purely military, it was theological. Babylon did not simply conquer the old Sumerian centers. It absorbed their administrative traditions, restructured their divine hierarchies, and produced a text that reordered the entire cosmic constitution to reflect its own supremacy. That text, Enuma Elish, did not describe Babylon's rise as political consolidation. It described it as the outcome of a war among gods. How a city with no divine inheritance transformed a legitimacy crisis into permanent cosmic authority is precisely what the next records reveal. Marduk did not offer to fight Tiamat out of loyalty, he negotiated a price first. That detail survives in Enuma Elish with unusual clarity, and it is the detail that transforms the entire text from cosmic drama into something that reads, under careful examination, more like a constitutional convention than a battle account. And Enuma Elish opens not with conflict but with cosmological order, the initial state of the governing structure before its internal tensions became irreconcilable. Tiamat, who had been part of the original divine assembly, does not rebel without cause. The texts record that the younger gods had disturbed the established order through their own administrative conduct. Tiamat's mobilization is a response to institutional grievance, and the assembly's failure to resolve that grievance through established procedure. When the assembly proves unable to contain her challenge, it turns to Marduk. His conditions are explicit and procedurally framed. If he defeats Tiamat, he receives permanent supreme authority over the divine assembly. His decrees will be binding without challenge. His position will not rotate, will not require renewal, will not be subject to assembly review. The assembly consents. In the language of institutional governance, they have just ratified a constitutional amendment, transferring irrevocable executive supremacy to a single office in exchange for crisis resolution. The battle itself is recorded. Tiamat is defeated. Her commander Kingu, to whom she had granted the Tablet of Destinies, in an act the texts describe, using the same unauthorized transfer terminology from the Anzu myth, is captured. The tablet returns to its institutional center, but this time it does not return to Enlil. Marduk keeps it. Here is the fact the theological record does not obscure, though it rarely receives the weight it deserves. Prior to Enuma Elish, Enlil held supreme executive authority in the Mesopotamian divine hierarchy. Yet his cult center at Nippur had been the theological legitimizing force for Sumerian kingship for over 1,000 years. Every major ruler of the early dynastic, Akkadian, and earthly period sought Nippur's sanction to authenticate their authority. Enuma Elish formally removes Enlil from that position. Marduk replaces him, not through gradual theological drift, not through reinterpretation, but through a documented transfer recorded in a text that was subsequently recited at the Babylonian New Year festival as official state theology. The timing of Enuma Elish's composition corresponds directly to Babylon's political consolidation under Hammurabi and his successors, the same period during which Babylonian administrative law, through the famous Law Code, was being extended over territories that had previously operated under independent Sumerian legal traditions. Babylon did not merely conquer those territories, it rewrote the cosmic authorization for governing them. What Enuma Elish records, then, is not a war that happened to have political consequences. It is a political reorganization that required a war to legitimate it. The distinction matters, because one is mythology with historical echoes. The other is constitutional regime change, documented in the only archival format the ancient world possessed. The war ended, then the paperwork began, and the paperwork, it turns out, was the point. Because what Marduk did after defeating Tiamat was not celebrate. According to Enuma Elish, he convened the divine assembly and systematically redistributed every major administrative office, assigning jurisdictions, redefining roles, and formalizing a hierarchical structure with his own authority permanently positioned above assembly review. This was not restoration of the previous order. It was a new constitution, ratified under the authority of the victor. The structural parallel to Hammurabi's administrative program is not circumstantial. Hammurabi, who ruled Babylon from approximately 1792 to 1750 BC, didn't govern his expanded territory through military occupation alone. He governed it through legal standardization. The famous Law Code, its stele now held at the Louvre, standing over 2 meters tall and inscribed with 282 provisions, was not primarily a criminal code. It was an administrative instrument, a mechanism for integrating conquered cities into a single procedural framework, replacing local legal traditions with Babylonian institutional authority. At the top of that stele, Hammurabi is depicted receiving the law directly from Shamash, the sun god and divine embodiment of justice. The law did not come from Hammurabi, it came through him. The same theological architecture that Enuma Elish built into the cosmic order, supreme authority descending through a divinely appointed administrator, appears carved into diorite and displayed publicly in every city Babylon absorbed. The divine reorganization and the civic reorganization were not parallel developments. They were the same argument, made in 2 registers simultaneously. What makes this pattern historically significant beyond Mesopotamia is what happens next. The Assyrian Empire, which succeeded Babylonian dominance, adopted the same theological legitimation framework, inserting their own chief deity Asher into a position structurally identical to Marduk's post-war supremacy. The administrative offices redistributed, the cosmic constitution updated, the victor's god elevated to a position the previous order had not sanctioned. Then Persia, then the Hellenistic kingdoms that followed Alexander, each new imperial consolidation accompanied by a theological rewrite. Gods promoted, demoted, merged or reframed to reflect the new distribution of earthly power. The pattern does not remain in Mesopotamia, it travels with the administrative model itself, which returns the record to its quiet, unsettling implication. If every major political consolidation in the ancient world produced a corresponding theological reorganization, if the rewrite of heaven consistently followed the rewrite of governance on earth, then the first Anunnaki war was not the origin of this pattern. It was simply the first time a civilization with a sophisticated enough archival system wrote it down. The clay tablets recorded it. Other civilizations inherited the method without the archive, and the question the tablets leave open is one the archive itself cannot answer. How many rewrites came before the scribes were there to document them? Somewhere in a climate-controlled drawer at the British Museum, a fragment of wet clay pressed into shape 4,000 years ago is still waiting to be fully translated. It is not the only one. Across London, Paris, Philadelphia, Istanbul and Baghdad, thousands of cuneiform tablets remain incompletely catalogued, not because scholars lack interest, but because the volume of what the Sumerians recorded exceeds the current capacity to process it. Estimates suggest that a significant portion of excavated tablets have never been formally read. The archive is larger than our ability to hear it. What the translated portions preserve is not a mythology in the sense that word has come to mean. It is an administrative memory, a civilization's attempt to document, with the same procedural care it applied to everything else, the structural forces that repeatedly threatened to collapse the systems it had built. Read in sequence, what those forces describe is not a story unique to the ancient world. A labour system reaches the limits of what its workforce can sustain. The governing structure adapts, but the adaptation introduces new pressures it was not designed to manage. Population strains administrative capacity. Environmental crisis accelerates institutional fracture. Policy disagreement within the governing assembly produces internal defection rather than unified response. The instrument of authority becomes vulnerable to seizure. Armed confrontation follows. The victor reorganizes the entire structure around permanent centralized control, each stage documented, each transition recorded, each consequence filed in the archive alongside the grain receipts and the legal contracts and the witnessed transfers of land. Here is what that sequence implies, and why it does not stay comfortably in the ancient past. The Sumerians were not describing a divine war as a way of explaining thunder or justifying ritual. They were describing the internal mechanics of institutional collapse, the specific sequential pressures that cause governing systems to fracture from within, using the only cosmological framework available to them for events of that magnitude. The framework was divine. The mechanics were administrative. And the mechanics are not ancient. Labour strain generating institutional pressure is not a Sumerian phenomenon. Demographic growth outpacing administrative capacity is not an early dynastic problem. Authority residing in symbols and procedures, rather than in the inherent legitimacy of those who hold power, is not a theological concept. It is a description of how authority has functioned in every documented civilization that followed. The midpoint shock of this entire investigation is not a single tablet or a single theft or a single flood decree undermined by internal defection. It is the realization that the Sumerians knew this pattern well enough to document it with procedural precision, which means they had already watched it unfold before they wrote it down. Enuma Elish was not composed as a warning. It was composed as a legitimation, which means by the time the scribes were recording the war, the consolidation had already happened. The tablets are not predicting institutional collapse, they are preserving its aftermath. Tablet YM67173 sits in Baghdad. Tablet K3473 sits in London. Fragments of Atrahasis sit in Paris. Between them, distributed across museums that were not designed to hold the pieces of a single coherent archive, they preserve what the Sumerians considered important enough to document with their most rigorous methodology. Not the thunder, not the monsters, the labour assignments that became unsustainable, the governing assembly that fractured over policy, the instrument of authority that changed hands without procedural consent, the reorganisation that followed armed confrontation and called itself permanent. These tablets are deteriorating. Conservation efforts extend their legibility, but the cuneiform pressed into wet clay was never meant to last indefinitely. The signs are weathering. The surfaces are becoming less distinct. Someday, specific words in this record will be unreadable. The procedural language dissolved, the witness formulas erased, the administrative memory returned to formless clay. But the pattern they describe does not require the tablets to survive. It only requires a governing system complex enough to generate the same pressures. The first Anunnaki war was not thunder in the sky. It was a workforce that reached its limit, a flood decree that was quietly circumvented, a tablet seized in a moment of institutional vulnerability, a cosmic constitution rewritten by the victor to ensure it could never be challenged again. It was the quiet reorganization of power, documented by the most precise archival civilization the ancient world produced, and filed, without categorical distinction, alongside everything else they considered real. The clay is still here. The question it leaves open is not whether this happened among gods, or among cities, or among the administrative systems that governed both. The question is simpler and considerably harder to answer. How many of the conflicts unfolding right now, in documents, in institutional disputes, in contested symbols of legitimate authority, will only become visible as wars long after the decisions have already been made? The Sumerian scribes knew to ask it. They pressed the question into wet clay and left it for whoever came next. You are whoever came next.